Bom, muito prazer receber todo mundo por aqui. Nessa manhã, eu sou Luiz Pires, atuo como gerente de sustentabilidade e inovação aqui na Ambiba. E a ideia é que hoje a gente faça, né, mais um dos workshops, o segundo, né, de uma série de 4 workshops sobre IFRS S1 e S2, focado aqui no mercado de capitais, focado na agenda de investidores. Né, hoje a nossa agenda prevê falarmos, né, sobre integração e governança, e a gente vai contar com 2 convidados muito especiais aqui, daqui a pouquinho vou apresentar. Então, queria, acho que começar aqui com a apresentação da agenda do dia. Então, a gente vai ter uma primeira parte, a gente vai falar um pouquinho, né, sobre como o IFRS, né, está acontecendo no mundo. Acho que é uma visão, né, trazida aqui pela Elizabeth Siger e pelo Nicolas Sebrel. Eles têm acho que um papel bastante interessante e uma experiência muito interessante para compartilhar com a gente. Bom, a Elizabeth tem mais de 20 anos de experiência, né, em diversas frentes de trabalho, desenvolvimento de padrões, investimentos, né, em vários temas relacionados à sustentabilidade. Ela é membro do ISSB, que é o International Sustainability Standards Board. A gente ouve muito falar sobre o ISSB, a importância dessa organização, né, para toda essa agenda de relato, de transparência. Ela é membro do ISSB e antes de se juntar à Fundação IFRS, ela foi diretora executiva, né, com foco em investimento sustentável da KKR, uma instituição de investimento global. Elizabeth, muito obrigado por estar aqui hoje, por compartilhar um pouco dessa experiência, do seu conhecimento com a gente de uma forma muito gentil. Eu queria também apresentar o Nick, que é diretor de relações com investidores do ISSB, tendo sido diretor executivo da ISSB, o braço de investimentos responsável do Institutional Shareholders Services Incorporation, um provedor de soluções ESG para asset owners, asset managers e hedge funds. Tá? E o que a gente vai falar, né, sobre essa conversa hoje, Nick? Muito obrigado também por compartilhar isso com a gente. Como orientações gerais, eu vou conduzir essa discussão em português, né? Tanto o Nick quanto a Elizabeth são muito generosos em compartilhar toda a sua experiência e também compartilhar o idioma com a gente, porque eles entendem bem o português. Qualquer dúvida que vocês tenham, vocês podem fazer inscrição, enviar perguntas pelo chat, pela ferramenta de perguntas e respostas, e qualquer coisa a gente faz uma tradução aqui ao vivo no meio do caminho, tá? Eles vão fazer a apresentação em inglês, né, por ser o idioma de maior conforto para eles, então a gente vai fazer, né, um jeito de acomodar aqui o melhor dos 2 mundos. Então acho que a ideia é que a gente fale um pouco sobre as ações do ISSB focado em investidores, né? Acho que é o nosso foco de toda essa agenda da jornada do IFRS, né? Ter esse foco no mercado de capitais. Então, a gente vai falar sobre, né, as questões que estão associadas ao nosso mercado, com foco muito grande no nosso mercado, os principais marcos, né, e o progresso na adoção dos estándares. Então, como a gente tem, como eles, né, como organização, estão se enxergando nessa agenda, o que eles enxergam, né, de próximos passos. Como, né, existe esse engajamento dos investidores, o trabalho do ISSB, né, com esse grupo de stakeholders, né, e como a gente olha para a oportunidade para a participação dos investidores no processo de construção dos estándares, né. Eu acho que essa é uma provocação importante, né. Eu gostaria de pedir para a Elizabeth e para o Nick focarem bastante nisso, como que a gente aqui, né, consegue trazer um pouco da experiência que a gente tem no dia a dia, né, dos requisitos que a gente entende são necessários, das demandas que a gente tem, e contribuir com a formação do padrão internacional, apresentando, falando, olha, no Brasil esse tipo de coisa é importante, né, e fazendo uma análise crítica. Eles estão sempre fazendo consultas públicas e pedindo a colaboração, né, das empresas que estão usando os padrões para melhorar, né, o seu próprio desempenho. Então, acho que isso é muito importante, termos esse espaço de conversa. Tá? Na segunda parte, a gente vai falar, né, sobre o recém-lançado relatório da Vale, né? Então, nesse momento, a gente dá uma pausa na gravação, a gente vai adotar o padrão da Chatham House Rules, onde a gente tem uma conversa aberta, uma conversa franca, e essa conversa ela fica restrita aos participantes desse diálogo. E a gente volta, né, na terceira parte, mais ou menos ali a partir das 11h30, já no final da nossa conversa, com a participação ali da Glaucia e da Regiane, nos ajudando, né, numa discussão de aprofundamento sobre tudo que foi conversado ao longo do dia. Tá? Então, só lembrando, né, relembrando um pouco da jornada e de por onde a gente começou. Então, a gente teve uma conversa de alinhamento inicial, onde a gente fala sobre integração e governança. Os próximos 2 workshops vão falar sobre materialidade, né, e a gente termina com a construção, né, de todo esse conhecimento sendo transformado num guia de como a gente enxerga a adoção do IFRS S1 e S2 aqui no Brasil, né, e toda a rede de inter-relações que ele tem aqui, quando a gente se conecta com o CBPS, que é o Comitê Brasileiro Representante Regional, como que está sendo, né, visto como regulação, então CVM, Banco Central, todo mundo de alguma forma olhando para essa agenda, tá certo? Então eu queria começar né, esse momento aqui. Então, mais uma vez, Elizabeth e Nicola, obrigado por serem, né, parceiros nessa nossa conversa. Queria agradecer a sua participação. Acho que a partir desse momento a gente já faz uma conversão aqui para o inglês. Bom, a tela é de vocês e muito obrigado por estarem aqui com a gente hoje.
Oi, obrigada, Luiz. Eu falo português, mas meu português é português de uma criança, porque eu morei lá em... Não, é verdade, morei lá no Rio de Janeiro até tinha 5 anos só. Mas Nick fala português muito bem, então talvez ele vai falar em português hoje. But I will speak in English, and I will speak as slowly as I can for the translation, but want to thank you all so very much for having us here today. I am going to share a presentation. Luis did a very good job introducing me and Nick, but I do want to add one thing that wasn't part of my biography, which is that in my role at KKR, I wore at least 2 hats. One was that I was an investor evaluating companies on their sustainability-related risks and opportunities. And the other was that I was a preparer because I was also overseeing our own reporting to public shareholders, to other stakeholders, and also to private fund investors. So I played a role very similar to, I think, many of yours, where I was frustrated as an investor because I wasn't getting the information I needed to make decisions, but I was also frustrated as a preparer because I had to respond to so many demands of our time. So Nick, why don't you go ahead and share the slides if you wouldn't mind. What we're going to do today is talk about how the ISSB's work focuses on investor needs. I'll talk about the current status of building the global baseline, and then I'll share some opportunities for investor input that are happening right now or coming soon. So Nick, if you turn to the slide 3, first content slide, and just as a reminder, I think you all know this already, but the ISSB's focus on investor needs is firmly part of our constitution, and we focus on the needs of the global capital markets. And in this case, the ISSB was created to solve for a very specific need, which is the one that I described in my last role. Investors not getting the information they needed, and if they got the information they needed, having very significant questions about the quality of that information. At the same time, companies being overwhelmed by competing and growing expectations for information, and ultimately everyone confused by the patchwork of voluntary disclosure efforts. So if you turn to the next page, we will see, the ISSB was created to solve for this problem by consolidating the disclosure landscape, the voluntary disclosure landscape, to support investor-related disclosures. I'm seeing language, something about captions. Should I change anything? Yes, I should change it. Okay, maybe this should help. Let me know if not. Okay. And as I hope you all know by now, the consolidation included the integrated reporting framework, the SASB standards, the TCFD, the CDSB, and ultimately also the TCFD. If you turn to the next page, Nick, the standards were always designed as a global baseline in a building block approach, which meant that jurisdictions could add to it to achieve policy objectives, or companies could add to it to communicate to stakeholders other than their investors. And this is really important as we think about jurisdictional adoption in jurisdictions that have additional policy goals, which I will talk about in a moment. You turn to the next slide, and this is a little bit of the vision that we have of the reporting landscape for investors. It's really about providing a holistic reporting package to enable investors to understand the full risks and opportunities that could affect a company's prospects. But as you can see here, enabling companies or jurisdictions to add on top of the global baseline in a way that is not adding complexity and cost to preparers. That's the vision. If you turn to the next slide, I think one of the things that's also important as we think about investors and investor needs is how we've designed the standards, the ISSB standards, to be fully connected where it makes sense and where it's relevant with the financial disclosures. And as you can see here in our standards, we've highlighted those aspects that are required to be the same, and those that are required to be consistent to the extent possible and relevant, ensuring that we are having a good connectivity between what are a company's sustainability related risks and opportunities and its prospects, and enabling investors to really understand that in a more comprehensive way. And then finally, I want to highlight on the next page that our focus on industry based disclosures is also in response to investors' demand for business relevant information. So information that is not a one size fits all approach, but that really takes into account a company's business activities and its particular risks and opportunities that are often occurring at an industry level. At the same time, we heard that companies really appreciate the industry-based approach because it is a proportional way to report. It's really focused on what is relevant to them. And so, as you know, I hope by now, the industry-based standards are built into the ISSB work as a requirement for companies to refer to and consider the industry-based standards. And so all of this is the background for how we take into account the investor perspective and how we're focused on the investor perspective. And in future slides, I will talk about some opportunities for you all to get involved, including in the SASB standards work that is going on right now. Before I do that, let's talk about recent milestones in adoption progress, because we do have some recent announcements that I want you all to be aware of. I think you know about the work that we've done since we launched the standards, a fair amount of work related to certainly getting the standards out there, but also the launch of our capacity building program, where we've been partnering with organizations around the world to support preparers and also investors as we're all learning this global language. So that was started in 2023 and 2024 and continues to this day. If you turn to the next slide, I'll also highlight that we continue to be very busy. And in 2024, we announced our 2-year work plan with the focus areas, which I'll talk about more in a moment. And we very recently announced our jurisdictional profiles, which are on the jurisdictions that are in the process of adopting the standards. And I also want to share more information with you all on that. So if you turn to the next page, I think hopefully you all are aware that we are seeing amazing momentum around the world. Brazil was certainly a leader in this. I was very happy to actually be in Brazil when the announcement was made that Brazil would be adopting the standards. And we have 35 other jurisdictions that have either finalized or are in the process of adopting or otherwise using the standards in their markets. And if you turn to the next slide, you'll see that this is a significant portion of the global capital markets, a really important evidence that these standards are fit for purpose and really important for all global capital markets. I'll note that while the United States is not one of those 36 jurisdictions that I mentioned, the state of California, in their climate disclosure rules, do allow ISSB reporters to use the ISSB standards. So that is also a pretty significant jurisdiction, even though it's not one of the ones that we count in our numbers. As I mentioned, we did just recently produce jurisdictional profiles and snapshots. Those were released at the end of June. And those profiles and snapshots provide details on each of, there's 17 profiles, I believe, and 16 snapshots that provide details on where each of those jurisdictions are today and what their targets are for reporting in the future. And the goal of providing this information is to enable you all and other capital markets participants to be able to know what exactly the expectations are across jurisdictions, and the kind of information that you will be receiving from that. I am going to now switch to some opportunities for investor input that are either here or on their way. And as a reminder, on the next page, the ISSB does follow the due process of the IFRS Foundation. And this means that we are committed to transparency, full and fair consultation, and accountability. Some of you may have listened in on our very long and deep board meetings, which are all public. All of our papers are public. And we take the feedback that we get from the market very, very seriously. And I joined the board in 2022. And a lot of the conversations that we had when I started were to evaluate the feedback that we got to our exposure drafts and to balance the needs of investors with what preparers were telling us was possible and relevant. And so the investor voice is so very critical to our work. We really do highlight the investor voice in all of the decisions that we make. And I encourage you all to pay attention to these projects that I'm going to talk about and the opportunities for you all to get engaged, and in particular because we not only want the investor perspective, but we want the perspective of investors from around the world. This is very critical to us. So next page, I'm going to talk a little bit about a part of our work plan. So these are the current priorities of the ISSB. Our first priority is supporting the implementation of S1 and S2. Which is really critical to ensuring that we actually build that global baseline. So a lot of capacity building programs through our own work or through partnerships. We do have a fair amount of educational material as well. Second area of focus here is you see adoption, which is the jurisdictional adoption work that I mentioned, but also supporting voluntary adoption of the standards. And so, one piece of this is that we created a voluntary adoption guide for companies that may be operating in jurisdictions that have no mandatory requirements or are not part of the entities required to report in those jurisdictions. And then finally, this very vague title work plan is related to our research projects and our standard setting projects. And that's what I want to talk to you more about today in the context of opportunities to provide input. If you turn to the next page, we have two research projects underway, thematic research projects underway. One is the one we call Biodiversity Ecosystem Services, or BEES. I think the word is abelhas in Portuguese, also known as nature. And then we also have a project on human capital, which is includes matters such as worker well-being, pay and benefits, diversity and inclusion, and working conditions in the value chain. And in both of these projects, if you turn to the next slide, we are now moving into the second phase of the research. So we concluded the first phase in the first half of this year, and now in the second half, we're moving into the second phase. And this second phase is going to help us assess whether standard setting is needed and whether it's likely to result in improvements in nature and human capital related disclosure. And so just as you can see here on these slides, which are going to be available to you, I believe, we have some key findings from the first phase of both of our research projects. And here, as you see from nature, some of our findings show that there's definitely investor interest in the topic. However, it is still very early as it relates to disclosures on this topic, and it is also very diverse in terms of the disclosures on this topic. And nature does present some complexities for standard setting, including that the topics are very diverse and can have different effects depending on a company's operations, where it's operating, including for regulatory reasons and also for simply ecosystem reasons. And also there is a requirement or request from investors that we're hearing around location specific information. And so this is the kind of feedback that we gathered in phase 1 of our research. In phase 2 of the research, the staff is working to pull together that information to come to recommendations for the board to consider. If you turn to the next page on human capital, here too, we found a lot of investor interest, and that actually human capital reporting in many ways is well established, but that the disclosure lacks consistency and comparability. And also, I think one of the interesting things about human capital is, in my perspective as a board member anyhow, is that it certainly does depend on or is affected by the cultural context in which a company is operating as well. And so we heard a lot of feedback from companies operating in different jurisdictions about different requirements in those jurisdictions. And so we took a hard look at those as part of phase 1. And like with nature, in phase 2, the staff will be evaluating the feedback and presenting some recommendations to the board. I think it's important to note that both of these projects are research projects, not standard setting projects. And so it could be that the board decides to create standard setting projects at the end of phase 2. It could be that the board decides that these are better served through industry-based standards. It could be that the board decides, actually, we don't need more standards, but we need more educational material. We haven't come to a conclusion on this point yet. In either case, there is still an opportunity for investors to provide input to these research projects. If you have something that you want to say about these topics and we haven't connected with you yet, we would love to set up some time to do that. In any case, if we move to the standard setting process, this will go through the same due diligence, not due diligence, that's investor speak, due process as all of our standard setting projects, and there will be public consultations in the future. But at the moment, these are still research projects. If you turn to the next page, this is breaking news. We just released an exposure draft on this today. But just to back up for a moment, the board, as part of its work plan, made a very strong commitment to enhancing the SASB standards. And that's because, as you know, they are part of our ISSB materials, but also because these standards were codified or finalized back in 2018, which in the world of sustainability is a very, very long time ago at this point. So we wanted to make sure that the standards took into account new developments or recent developments in the markets, wanted to make sure that they fully reflected the global stakeholder perspective, and also wanted to make sure that to the extent it was reasonable, relevant for investors, that there was interoperability with other standard setters such as EFRAG, GRI, and the TNFD, among others. So this is our work. These are our work streams here. In 2025, we have a phase 1 of enhancing 12 industries, which you can see there. In addition to that, we have what we call targeted amendments, which are proposed amendments to 41 additional, at least in this exposure draft, which I'll describe in a minute, but 41 additional industries. And what that means is if we're making a proposed amendment in any of these 12 industries that you see on the left, we want to make sure that that metric or topic is consistent in other industries if that's relevant and important. And in the future, we'll be prioritizing additional industries for work, and so that will be occurring probably in the coming year. If you turn to the next slide, this is our exposure draft, which, as I mentioned, was just released this morning our time, afternoon Nick's time in Europe. It will. This is focused on the first 8 industries, which are all in the extractive sector, and also the processed foods industry. In the Q4 of 2025, we plan to, timing is not fully confirmed, also do the same for agricultural products, meat, poultry and dairy, and the electric utilities industries. Now, this exposure draft is a pretty significant one. And so the board decided to give a 150-day comment period, which is actually more than our usual comment period of 120 days. And that's because this is such an important exposure draft for us. There's a lot of content, and we understand that people might need translations. The content has been available as a draft form since June 6th. So hopefully people are starting to take a look at that. And when you open the exposure draft, you'll see that we have marked up the changes. So there's a black line version, so you can see the changes that we are proposing. We do understand that stakeholders will have various reasons for participating in the consultation, so they can focus on particular industries or topics. And so the questionnaire that we built is intended to allow people to respond to different pieces that are interesting to them. And it will be accompanied by educational material that will come out in a week or two, I expect, that helps people understand how the SASB standards interact with the ISSB requirements. I strongly encourage everyone on this call to please provide input to this to this exposure draft. It's very critical to get your voices. Let's go to my very last slide, which will give us time for questions. If you turn on the next one, Nick. I just want to sort of conclude with how investors can get engaged with the ISSB's work. First, of course, respond to public consultations. I just described the SASB enhancements consultation that is open now. It is open until, I believe, November 30th. There are other ways to get involved. So I mentioned the research projects. All of the research output that we have done is publicly available. And if you want to participate in these research projects in some sort of way, please reach out to me and Nick, and we'll make sure that we hear your perspective. Finally, I encourage you to follow and utilize our educational materials and resources. We have a huge amount of content that we are updating regularly. Very recently, for example, we produced new guidance material on educational material on disclosing on transition plans. That was a really important one to reduce the fragmentation of disclosure expectations on transition plans. So that's one example. We also have a really great guide on materiality and how to identify risks and opportunities that could affect a company's prospects, and then what is material information about that. And it's endless. We also have training courses on there. We recently put out a new training course that is free for people to use. And so I do encourage you all to take a look at that. And then finally, the investor voice is, as I hope you've heard me say many times now, so very critical to our work. It is also so very critical to the adoption of the standards around the world. So there's some ways that if you have made references to old reporting standards and frameworks or legacy standards and frameworks like SASB or TCFD or IIRC or others, there's an opportunity to update your materials to do that. And then also, as jurisdictions are consulting on their pathway for adopting and using the standards, we have heard that the investor voice is also very important there. So I will conclude there. Before we take questions, I do want to just ask Nick if there's anything else that you think I forgot or that you would like to add, if Nick is still there.
No, I think you covered it. I would just stress again that our contact details are available, and any questions that have come up later, certainly happy to address those.
Thank you. And Luis, I will turn it back to you.
Elizabeth, muito obrigado pela apresentação. Eu gostaria de provocar, né, os nossos convidados aqui para perguntas e respostas, e eu já queria trazer, acho que dois momentos que para mim foram muito marcantes da sua fala, né? Que eu acho que eles se conectam com, acho que ações que a gente, de uma forma um pouco mais estruturada, pode colaborar de uma maneira bastante efetiva. Eu acho que em relação a olharmos para os estándares, os novos padrões, né, de uma maneira colaborativa, me parece ser um espaço bastante interessante de colaboração. Né? Eu acho que eu queria aproveitar aqui esse momento onde estamos todos reunidos aqui, então o time da Ondas Sustentáveis que tem nos apoiado nessa jornada, mas eu quero deixar uma provocação aqui para a gente entender como a gente conseguiria viabilizar de repente um encontro específico para a gente ter uma apresentação sobre, eventualmente vocês puderem nos apoiar com uma apresentação sobre os estándares, né, e que a gente crie uma colaboração, um mecanismo de colaboração coletiva. Um encontro para discutir especificamente os estándares e gerar colaborações, acho, com uma perspectiva dos nossos associados aqui. Me parece que talvez seja uma oportunidade importante para levar uma visão, né, do Brasil sobre alguns itens que são muito relevantes, né? Olhar para a energia, olhar para a agricultura, olhar para transportes no Brasil tem muitas particularidades da nossa realidade. Eu acho que é importante que a gente consiga, né, estruturar uma visão e levar para vocês. Eu acho que seria muito adequado do nosso lado, né, da nossa parte aqui, mostrar como a gente enxerga, né, que alguns temas são mais ou menos relevantes e levar isso como uma contribuição, porque a gente sabe que em vários momentos, né, os padrões internacionais eles tentam homogeneizar uma situação que ela tem algumas variações ao longo do tempo, né, e a gente vê para alguns setores, então acho que quando a gente especialmente olha para energia, para transportes, né, para a agricultura no Brasil, a gente tem características muito particulares. Então, já deixando uma provocação para o nosso time aqui também, né? Como que a gente se prepara, né? Considerando que são 150 dias, né, do prazo de consulta pública, para a gente gerar uma contribuição efetiva e convidar os nossos associados para participar disso. Eu acho que essa é a minha primeira reação, tá? Eu acho que, assim, temos uma boa oportunidade. E uma segunda que olha aqui para... Quando a gente olha, eu fiquei bastante motivado com o BIS, né, esse projeto que vocês estão fazendo para olhar para ecossistemas, né, para a natureza de uma forma geral. A gente tem conversado bastante com o time TNFD para entender se faria sentido, né, ter de repente um projeto piloto de implementação da TNFD aqui com gestores brasileiros. Isso, né, se a gente conseguir viabilizar uma iniciativa como essa, deve acontecer agora no segundo semestre, então acho que já fica aqui minha provocação para os associados, para os participantes, aqueles que têm interesse em discutir um pouco mais profundamente a TNFD, né, já nos acionem aqui para a gente mapear né, qual que é o tamanho do interesse, né, do mercado, mas uma vez conseguindo viabilizar uma iniciativa como essa, a gente vai ter bastante contribuição também, né, para essa frente de pesquisa, onde conseguiríamos levar uma experiência prática, né, de casos brasileiros, ou de como a gente está conseguindo analisar isso à luz da TNFD, né, possivelmente com uma colaboração, né, para o desenvolvimento dos novos padrões, né, se eles se tornarem novos padrões em algum momento. Então, eu acho que seria, assim, acho que são dois momentos de bastante colaboração, Elizabeth, muito no sentido de como a gente, né, olha para o mercado organizado e estruturado, como que a gente tem aqui no Brasil, né, e cria uma colaboração que reflita a nossa realidade, né, coletiva. Então, acho que é um pouco do papel que a gente consegue colaborar de uma forma bastante ativa. Tá? Eu queria deixar o espaço para perguntas e respostas. Pessoal, alguém tem alguma dúvida, gostaria de um aprofundamento?
Eu só queria fazer uma pergunta para Elizabeth, se a gente pode mandar essa apresentação para os participantes. Ok, né?
Yes, this is okay, and we will also, Nick and I will put our contact information in the chat. We will also put the link to the exposure draft. I think Nick just did that, as well as the other resources that I mentioned here as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to, Louise, I understand, as in our last conversation, I understood 80% of what you said, I think, and yeah, just want to say yes. No. This is my practice, right? So next time I'll present in Portuguese, maybe. Yes, these are really important moments. We need your input, and so happy to have more of these conversations. I think you know that we have a partnership with a TNFD also, right, where we are committed to build on their work, rather create our own separate approach to nature. That doesn't mean we are going to copy and paste TNFD's work. So the practical application and the experiences that you share are very important for that. So yes, would love to hear more about that. I also see a question in the Q&A section where it says, since investors are primary users, are there plans to create a network or partnership with the CFA or UNPRI to facilitate collective debate and learning? And I'm going to invite Nick to respond to this in a moment. We are involved with both of those organizations in some way or another. Nick and I plan to be at PRI in person in São Paulo in November. And we also engage with any investor network that you think is relevant for us in various ways. We also do have our Sustainability Alliance, which is a membership where we do have investors who form an important point of information for us. And then we also have our Investor Advisory Group, which is another network that came from the SASB standards work that also informs our work. But any other ideas of events we should attend or organizations that we should engage with, we are happy to hear them. Nick, sorry, anything you would add?
Sim, só para complementar. Sim, temos vários parceiros. Tem CFA Institute, tem EFAS aqui na Europa, APIMEC, Anbima, obviamente, e temos também uma ideia que, se tiver outros grupos que você acha que é importante que nós falamos, conversamos, e para pedir feedback pode ser formal, no lado de exposure drafts, ou pode ser informal, sobre ideias e essas coisas que você acha que falta, ou coisas que estamos fazendo que são coisas boas, por exemplo. A porta é sempre aberta e vocês têm nosso contato. Finalmente, que você não... Seria melhor para nós se vocês individualmente dar comentários nos exposure drafts, mas também tem a opção para fazer como grupo, no grupo junto com a Anbima ou outro grupo, como seja. Mas eu acho que o mais é melhor nesse caso, que assim podemos ver quais são as pessoas que acham que quais são as partes mais importantes e para nós é um pouco mais transparente quando tem os fundos individuais, os companhias individuais, mas de qualquer modo os dois métodos são bons. Desculpa.
Perfeito, Nick. Eu acho que a gente pode seguir nesse caminho, e aí olhando para o ecossistema nacional, né, para as grandes associações, me parece que FEBRABAN e CNSEG também são pontos de contato relevantes, tá? E aí a gente tem feito vários projetos em parceria, né, com essas duas organizações, e se vocês quiserem, né, entenderem que faz sentido, a gente pode provocar uma reunião de alinhamento e, eventualmente, a gente pode fazer um grande movimento, porque os mesmos associados aqui, né, da Ambima, eles também, né, muitas vezes estão na FEBRABAN, muitos deles, né, a sobreposição é muito grande, tá? Temos uma nova pergunta aqui. Como o projeto BI se enquadraria em uma empresa pública? Empresa pública, it's a public company, Elizabeth.
Yeah, the word I don't know is enquadraria.
Oh,
How it fit.
Will fit.
Yes.
How it fit.
With a public company.
It's a state-owned company.
Okay. It is hard for me to answer that question, right? Because our standards are written for capital markets participants to communicate to their investors. So to the extent any of our standards are relevant for this business, then the B's work should also be. But as with everything, the standards are subject to every company's assessment of materiality, an entity-specific assessment of materiality. So it could be that this organization determines in the future that this work is not relevant. But let me back up a little bit. As I said, this is a research project right now. It's not a standard-setting project yet. That said, S1, if you apply it, does require a company to disclose all of its sustainability-related risks and opportunities that could affect its prospects or material information about that. And so already, if a company is applying S1 and they determine that nature aspects could affect their prospects, then they are already required to disclose information about that to their investors. So the work on the research project on nature and human capital is trying to understand, do we need to provide more guidance on these topics to the markets or not? And so still have to decide what that is. It could be that we decide nature as a topic, as a large topic, we cannot write standards for, but maybe we can or should write standards for water, or maybe for deforestation. So we have a lot of decisions to make still before we get to the point where companies need to consider additional standards on nature that aren't already there.
Obrigado, Elizabeth. Pessoal, mais alguma pergunta? Eu vi aqui que nossas perguntas e respostas, os microfones estão abertos, tá? Fiquem à vontade para levantar a mão e fazer perguntas diretamente também. Creio que a gente já acho que esgotou as perguntas sobre essa parte da apresentação, então queria agradecê-la, Elizabeth, queria agradecê-lo, Nick, pela participação de vocês, né, por compartilharem um pouco do seu tempo, do seu conhecimento com a gente. Fica, né, aqui o nosso compromisso, né, de olhar com mais proximidade, de estarmos mais perto, né, dessas revisões dos estándares, para que a gente gere colaborações, né, e de alguma forma facilite o caminho dos associados para, primeiro, se antecipar a esses novos estándares e para que a gente possa gerar contribuições com uma perspectiva local. Eu acho que é bastante importante esse nosso papel. Então, queria agradecer mais uma vez pela participação de vocês, convidá-los para continuar nos próximos passos. Então, nessa segunda parte aqui da nossa conversa, a gente vai Bom, ter um momento muito especial aqui, a gente vai discutir sobre o primeiro relatório, né, seguindo esses novos padrões que foi lançado, né, o relatório da Vale. A partir desse momento, pessoal, a gente vai suspender a gravação, a gente segue num formato de Chatham House Rules, né, onde a discussão ela fica restrita aos participantes dessa conversa, justamente para que a gente tenha toda a tranquilidade, né, para trazer nossos pontos de dúvida, nossos questionamentos, nossas reflexões sobre isso, lembrando que a ideia, né, é que a gente consiga entender como esse conjunto de informações pode, né, ser usado pelo mercado, como isso facilita o processo de análise, né, a gente está testando a vida real a partir de agora, né, as empresas começam a se posicionar, e eu acho que a ideia é que a gente consiga, né, ter uma avaliação um pouco mais adequada, que a gente consiga entender e discutir se está fazendo sentido, se não está fazendo sentido, né, como a gente evolui a partir disso. Tá certo? Queria chamar para nos apoiar nessa